February 19th, 1944. Underground Command Bunker, Rabaul, New Britain. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's hand trembled slightly as he wrote in his private journal, recording words that would have earned him a court-martial if discovered by Imperial headquarters. The Americans are not fighting us. They are strangling us. Each bypassed garrison is another weight dragging the Empire toward the ocean floor. Through the narrow ventilation shaft, he could hear the distant rumble of B-24 liberators, the daily milk run that had become as regular as sunrise since the Americans decided Rabaul wasn't worth capturing. 100,000 Japanese troops, the cream of the Imperial Army and Navy, sat useless on this volcanic island, watching American forces sail past toward Japan. The once mighty fortress of Rabaul, which had been developed into a major fleet base and the most heavily defended Japanese position in the South Pacific, was being systematically neutralized without invasion. What Kusaka was witnessing, and what terrified him more than any banzai charge or naval bombardment, was a new form of warfare that rendered Japanese defensive doctrine obsolete. The Americans weren't playing by the rules of Bushido. They weren't seeking glorious battle. They were methodically dismantling the Japanese Empire through calculated neglect, turning strength into weakness, fortresses into prisons. The mathematics of defeat were being written not in casualty lists, but in shipping manifests that would never arrive, in airfields that would never again launch a zero, in soldiers who would die not from American bullets but from disease, starvation, and irrelevance. The Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific had been conceived in the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters with a beautiful symmetry that appealed to the military mind. Each island fortress would be an unsinkable aircraft carrier, each garrison a blade pointed at the American advance. The enemy would be forced to assault these positions, bleeding themselves white against Japanese steel and spirit. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo himself had proclaimed in September 1943 the establishment of the Absolute National Defense Zone, a defensive perimeter bounded by the southern half of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, the Bonin Islands, the Marianas, Western New Guinea, Malaya, and Burma. Every strongpoint would be held to the last man. Every island would become a fortress. The Americans would have to pay in blood for every metre of sand. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura commanded 50,000 elite troops of the 8th Area Army. The harbour bristled with 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 airfields could launch hundreds of aircraft. The complex included Lakunai and Vunakanau pre-war Australian strips, with Rapopo operational since December 1942, with concrete runways and extensive maintenance facilities, and Tobera completed in August 1943. Miles of underground tunnels connected defensive positions, hospitals, and supply depots carved from volcanic rock. Rabaul is impregnable, Imamura had written to Tokyo in November 1943. The Americans will shatter themselves against our defences like waves against a seawall. What neither Imamura nor Imperial headquarters understood was that the Americans had no intention of giving them their glorious battle. The revelation began in June 1943, disguised as victory. When American forces landed on Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands on June 30th, Japanese commanders initially celebrated. These islands were barely defended. The Americans were clearly afraid to assault real Japanese positions. Captain Toshio Takahashi, intelligence officer at Rabaul, wrote in his analysis, "The enemy lacks the stomach for heavy combat. They nibble at the edges like mice, afraid of the lion." But something disturbed him about the pattern. The Americans weren't just taking easy targets. They were specifically choosing islands where they could construct airfields. Woodlark and Kiriwina were perfectly positioned to provide air cover for operations that had nothing to do with attacking nearby Japanese strongholds. The disquiet grew when American forces invaded New Georgia on June 30th, 1943. The Japanese had 10,500 troops defending the island, centred around the vital airfield at Munda Point. Finally, a real battle. But after savage fighting that lasted until August, the Americans secured the airfield and then stopped. They didn't pursue the retreating Japanese forces. They didn't attempt to clear the entire island. They simply built up Munda and moved on. Major Kenji Hatano, who survived the New Georgia campaign, reported to Rabaul, "The Americans fight differently. They take what they need and leave us the rest. It is as if we don't matter to them." By November 1943, the pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. The American offensive, designated Operation Cartwheel, wasn't aimed at capturing Japanese bases. It was aimed at making them irrelevant. Admiral Minechi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had responded to the Allied invasion of Bougainville by rushing carrier aircraft to Rabaul. On November 1, 1943, he transferred 173 carrier aircraft, 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 reconnaissance planes, from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiho, Junyo, Hiyo, and Ryuho to reinforce Rabaul. These were Japan's last trained carrier pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor, savaged the British at Ceylon, and fought at Midway. They were the sharp edge of Japanese naval aviation, now committed to defending a base the Americans had already decided not to attack. The American response was swift and devastating. On November 5th, carrier aircraft from USS Saratoga and USS Princeton struck Rabaul, heavily damaging 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers. On November 11th, they returned with Essex, Bunker Hill and Independence, damaging most remaining warships. But it was what happened next that began the psychological unraveling of Japanese commanders. The Americans didn't invade. They didn't follow up their advantage. They simply left, having destroyed 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft, along with 82 of 193 aircrew. Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the November battles, wrote in a letter discovered after the war, "We won. We drove them off. So why does it feel like we lost? They damaged our ships, shot down our planes, and sailed away. We cannot chase them. We cannot strike back. We can only wait for them to come again." Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai, senior staff officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, began keeping meticulous records of what the bypass strategy meant in practical terms. His classified reports, captured after the war, provide a chilling mathematical progression of strategic strangulation. November 1943. Rabaul receives 30,000 tons of supplies monthly, fuel reserves at 60%, ammunition adequate for 6 months of combat. December 1943. Supply convoys increasingly difficult. American submarines sink 2 vessels for every one that arrives. Monthly deliveries down to 18,000 tons. January 1944. No surface vessels have reached Rabaul in 3 weeks. Submarine deliveries only. 2,000 tons this month. Fuel reserves at 30%. By February 1944, the Japanese High Command made the decision to stop provisioning Rabaul with fighters or bombers, recognizing the futility of reinforcing an isolated garrison. The mathematics were inexorable. Without supplies, even the mightiest fortress becomes a prison. Captain Takeo Takagi, commanding a destroyer squadron at Rabaul, faced an impossible equation. He had fuel for perhaps one major sortie. But where would he go? The Americans had taken the Admiralty Islands in February 1944, completing Rabaul's encirclement. Every direction led to enemy-controlled waters. "We are a fleet that cannot sail," he wrote, "warriors who cannot fight. We have become military theatre, maintaining the pretense of threat while the real war passes us by." What the Americans had discovered, whether through brilliant planning or fortunate accident, was that the Japanese island garrisons could be defeated by the Pacific itself. Each bypassed island became a green hell where the jungle, disease, and starvation did the work of infantry divisions. Dr. Shigeaki Yamauchi, chief medical officer at Rabaul, documented the slow dissolution of combat effectiveness. December 1943. Malaria cases increasing. Medical supplies adequate. Quinine reserves for 4 months. Combat readiness, 85%. March 1944. 30% of garrisons suffering from malaria, dengue fever or dysentery. Quinine exhausted. Using local bark substitutes with limited effectiveness. Combat readiness, 60%. June 1944. Malnutrition now primary concern. Rice rations cut to 400 grams daily. Soldiers supplementing with jungle plants, many toxic. 17 deaths from poisonous vegetation this month. Combat readiness, 40%. The Americans had turned time into a weapon. Every day that passed weakened the Japanese garrisons while American forces grew stronger, leaping from island to island, building airfields and ports, creating an infrastructure of victory, while Japanese strongholds rotted in tropical isolation. On Wake Island, bypassed since October 1943, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara commanded approximately 4,000 Japanese troops. Once a vital refueling point for trans-Pacific flights, Wake had been transformed into a fortress bristling with coastal guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and underground bunkers. The Americans simply ignored it. Sakaibara would be promoted to Rear Admiral only in October 1944, but by then his command was already irrelevant. Sakaibara's reports to Tokyo, transmitted by submarine-delivered radio parts, grew increasingly desperate. November 1943. Enemy carrier aircraft struck installations, awaiting invasion force, all positions manned and ready. January 1944. No invasion materialized. Enemy ships pass by weekly, beyond range of coastal guns. Request instructions. April 1944. Food situation critical. Fishing provides some relief but insufficient for garrison. Many men showing signs of malnutrition. When will relief come? On Woliai Atoll in the Caroline Islands, 6,426 Japanese troops under Major General Katsumi Kitamura experienced similar abandonment. The Americans had seized nearby islands for airfields, but left Wolaiai's garrison to wither. Kitamura's diary, recovered after the war, chronicles the psychological disintegration. March 31, 1944. The enemy task force sailed past again today, close enough to see through binoculars but beyond reach of our guns. They don't even consider us worth destroying. May 15, 1944. Received radio message that all available forces are being concentrated for decisive battle. We are not included. We have become military orphans. August 2nd, 1944. Men have begun cultivating gardens. This is not warriors' work, but survival demands it. I fear we are becoming farmers, not soldiers. The American carrier raids that periodically struck bypassed bases served a purpose beyond military damage. They were psychological operations designed to remind the Japanese garrisons of their helplessness. At Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, approximately 27,000 troops and the Fourth Fleet had created what strategists considered an impregnable bastion. On February 17 to 18, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the US Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force conducted massive air raids that destroyed over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons, and killed 4,500 Japanese personnel. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding at Truk, experienced a commander's worst nightmare: irrelevance. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters revealed the psychological impact. The American carriers appeared from nowhere, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished. We could not pursue. We could not retaliate. We could only endure and repair damage, knowing they will return when they choose. This is not warfare. It is torment. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. Marcus Island, Palau, Yap, each received attention from American carriers just often enough to prevent any coherent defense planning, never enough to provide the honorable battle Japanese commanders craved. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 provided the most devastating proof of the island-hopping strategy's effectiveness. When American forces invaded on June 15, 1944, they brought overwhelming force, over 300,000 men in more than 500 ships. But what terrified Japanese strategists wasn't the assault on Saipan. It was all the fortresses they hadn't assaulted. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the defense of Saipan, received his last situation report on July 6, 1944, before his final Banzai charge. It catalogued the Empire's paralyzed forces. Truk, 27,000 troops, isolated, no naval support possible. Rabaul, 100,000 troops isolated, reduced to growing vegetables. Wake, 4,000 troops, isolated, surviving on fishing. Marcus, 4,000 troops, isolated, water shortage critical. Waliai, 6,426 troops, isolated, starvation imminent. Over 200,000 Japanese troops, equipped with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft and elaborate fortifications, sat helpless while the Americans drove toward Japan. These weren't casualties, they were worse. They were military assets transformed into liabilities. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived at Iwo Jima in June 1944, he brought with him a revolutionary understanding born from watching the island-hopping campaign. He immediately recognized that Iwo Jima could not be held. The Americans will surely invade this Iwo Jima en route to the mainland of Japan, and the time of their assault will be very soon. Unlike his predecessors who planned for victory, Kuribayashi planned for the most effective defeat possible. He had studied what happened to bypassed garrisons and understood the strategic calculus perfectly. Rather than establishing defences on the beach to contest landings directly, he opted for defence in depth, ordering construction of 18 kilometres of tunnels and 5,000 cave positions beneath the island. In a letter to his wife that would only be delivered after his death, Kuribayashi explained his strategy. "I do not fight to win, that is impossible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a price that they will think twice before invading Japan. Every Marine we kill here is one who cannot invade the homeland. We are not defending Iwo Jima. We are defending Japan with our deaths." This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese military thinking. Kuribayashi explicitly forbade Banzai charges until the final days, considering them wasteful, and ordered every soldier to fight as long as possible before being killed. The island-hopping strategy had taught Japanese commanders that heroic death meant nothing if it didn't serve a strategic purpose. What Japanese commanders slowly realized was that the Americans had revolutionized warfare itself. The island-hopping strategy wasn't just about avoiding strong points. It was about creating a new form of military logistics that made traditional defensive positions obsolete. Commander Chihaya Takahashi, a staff officer who analyzed American operations, wrote a report that was suppressed by Imperial headquarters. The Americans do not capture islands. They create floating bases. Each captured atoll becomes a fuel depot, each lagoon an anchorage, each airstrip a projection of power. They have made the Pacific Ocean itself into a highway for their war machine. The Liberty ships were producing 3 vessels per day at peak production. While Japanese garrisons carefully rationed their last tons of rice, American construction battalions were pouring concrete for runways that could handle 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, studied American logistics from his post in Tokyo and reached a chilling conclusion. "We prepared for a war of warriors. They are fighting a war of engineers. While we perfect the art of dying, they perfect the art of supply. Each bypassed garrison weakens us. Each new airfield strengthens them. Time itself has become our enemy. Complementing the island-hopping strategy was the American submarine campaign that turned Japanese resupply efforts into suicide missions. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese vessels faster than they could be replaced. Admiral Naokuni Nomura, commanding submarine operations from Truk, documented the impossibility of supporting bypassed garrisons. January 1944, lost I-169 attempting to resupply Bougainville garrison. 40 tons of supplies lost. February 1944, I-43 damaged by aircraft while approaching Rabaul. Mission aborted. March 1944, I-42 sunk attempting to evacuate key personnel from Wake Island. April 1944, submarine resupply missions suspended indefinitely. Cannot justify loss of boats for minimal supply delivery. The submarines that had once been the lifeline for bypassed garrisons became too precious to risk. Each isolated fortress was truly alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the fatal consequences of the island-hopping strategy on Japanese naval aviation. Japan had already lost 121 of 173 veteran carrier pilots defending Rabaul, stripping the carrier fleet of its most experienced aviators. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, faced an impossible situation. His carriers were filled with inexperienced pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time. The veteran instructors who should have trained them were dead or trapped on bypassed islands. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19th to 20th, 1944. Japanese losses: 550 to 645 aircraft destroyed, 3 fleet carriers sunk, Taiho, Shokaku, Hyo, approximately 3,000 personnel killed. American losses: 123 aircraft, 109 killed. The 10-to-1 kill ratio reflected not just American superiority, but Japanese degradation from the bypass strategy. In his after-action report, Ozawa wrote, "We have carriers without pilots, pilots without experience, experience without opportunity to gain it. The enemy's strategy has not just defeated us, it has made it impossible for us to become capable of victory." By mid-1944, a surreal transformation was occurring across the bypassed Japanese garrisons. Elite combat units, trained for years in the art of war, were becoming agricultural communes struggling for survival. On Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that would have seemed insane 2 years earlier. Effective immediately, all units will devote 50% of daylight hours to food production. Each soldier must cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders will be evaluated on agricultural yield, not combat readiness. Imamura ordered the cultivation of fields to accumulate harvests, recognizing that the Americans had chosen to blockade rather than invade. The fortress of Rabaul, built to threaten Allied operations across the Pacific, had become a vast prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto, commanding an infantry regiment, wrote in his diary, "My samurai ancestors would weep to see us. We who trained to die gloriously in battle now tend sweet potatoes and raise chickens. The Americans have not just defeated us, they have humiliated us with irrelevance." Similar scenes played out across the Pacific. On Walaei, soldiers raised pigs. On Truk, they fished with improvised nets. On Wake, they attempted to grow vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered half of Asia, was reduced to subsistence farming. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the island-hopping strategy was that it took months or even years for bypassed commanders to fully understand their situation. Radio contact with Tokyo continued, orders were still issued, promotions still announced. The fiction of military relevance was maintained even as reality diverged completely. General Imamura at Rabaul continued to receive operational orders from Imperial General Headquarters as late as December 1944. Prepare for coordinated offensive in conjunction with Philippine operations. Maintain readiness to interdict enemy supply lines. The absurdity of such orders, asking a garrison that hadn't seen a supply ship in 8 months to conduct offensive operations, reveals the complete disconnection between Japanese High Command's perception and battlefield reality. By April 1944, the last Japanese submarine had fled Rabaul, the last surface vessel had departed, and no aircraft had taken off in over a month. By early 1945, the bypass strategy evolved into its cruelest phase. While there was no formal operation specifically targeting gardens, American forces did periodically bomb the agricultural efforts of bypassed garrisons. B-24 bombers struck the gardens that bypassed garrisons had cultivated. Fighter sweeps machine-gunned fishing boats. Even the attempt to survive was denied. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, agricultural officer at Waliai, recorded, 6 months of work destroyed in 10 minutes. The corn we nursed from seeds, the vegetables we watered with our drinking rations, all burning. The Americans didn't bomb our gun positions or ammunition dumps. They bombed our food. They know exactly what they're doing. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, approximately 300,000 Japanese troops remained on bypassed islands. At Rabaul alone, 69,000 Japanese troops remained when Japan surrendered. These men had survived not through combat, but through cultivating gardens, fishing, and slowly starving. The surrender created a surreal situation. Many bypassed garrisons didn't believe the surrender announcement, convinced it was American propaganda. Others, even believing it, had no way to surrender. They were on islands with no American presence. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto on Mili Atoll in the Marshall Islands faced this dilemma. The war is over, but we have no one to surrender to. The Americans bypassed us so thoroughly they forgot we existed. We must wait for them to remember us. Some garrisons waited weeks or months before American forces arrived to accept their surrender. During this time, they existed in a strange limbo, no longer at war, but not yet at peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, architect of the Central Pacific Campaign, later reflected on the island-hopping strategy. We learned that the quickest way to defeat Japan was not to fight the Japanese. Every bypassed island represented thousands of soldiers we didn't have to kill, tons of ammunition we didn't have to expend, American lives we didn't have to sacrifice. We turned their strength against them. General Douglas MacArthur, though initially resistant to bypassing major targets, eventually recognized the strategy's brilliance, particularly after the decision to bypass Rabaul saved enormous Allied casualties. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, who wrote in his diary in February 1945, "The Americans have discovered the perfect strategy against the Japanese warrior spirit. They have made our courage irrelevant, our fortifications useless, our bushido meaningless. We prepared to die gloriously. They sentenced us to live shamefully. This is worse than defeat. This is erasure." The mathematics of the island-hopping strategy reveal its devastating effectiveness. Japanese forces bypassed. Rabaul, 100,000 troops initially, 69,000 at surrender. Truk, approximately 27,000 troops. Waliai, 6,426 troops, 1,650 survived to surrender. Wake, 4,000 troops. Marcus, 4,000 troops. Various other garrisons, tens of thousands more. Total, an estimated 300,000 Japanese troops neutralized without major combat. Strategic success rate. Of the 26 major Japanese bases bypassed, none managed to significantly interfere with American operations after being isolated. The island-hopping strategy's greatest success wasn't military, but psychological. It shattered the fundamental assumptions of Japanese military doctrine, Japanese strategy always aimed for decisive battle where spiritual superiority would overcome material disadvantage. The Americans refused to provide it. Japan had spent decades fortifying Pacific islands. The Americans demonstrated that fortifications only matter if someone attacks them. Japanese military culture glorified death in combat. The Americans sentenced them to survival in irrelevance. Japanese doctrine held that superior will could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans made will itself irrelevant. Captain Yoshitaka Shindo, intelligence officer on bypassed Marcus Island, wrote the most perceptive analysis. We were prepared for American strength. We were prepared for American technology. We were not prepared for American indifference. They have found the one thing the Japanese warrior cannot fight, being ignored. By late 1944, some Japanese commanders began to understand and adapt to the new reality, but it was too late. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima had studied the island-hopping campaign and designed his defense accordingly. Not to win, but to make victory so costly that Americans would reconsider invading Japan. His approach, no banzai charges, no attempts to hold the beaches, fighting from elaborate tunnel systems, represented a complete rejection of traditional Japanese tactics. He had learned from the bypass strategy that the only value of a defensive position was the cost it could inflict on an attacker who chose to attack it. The defense extended the expected 5-day battle to 36 days, inflicting nearly 26,000 American casualties, including 6,821 killed. General Holland Smith called Kuribayashi the most redoubtable of all Pacific adversaries. Similarly, the defense of Okinawa in 1945 showed Japanese adaptation to the lessons of island hopping. Instead of attempting to defeat the invasion, defenders sought to make it so costly that America would seek negotiated peace rather than invade Japan. The greatest irony of the island-hopping strategy was that it used Japan's own dedication against itself. Every bypassed garrison that refused to surrender, every soldier who chose death over dishonor, every commander who followed orders to hold at all costs became a self-imposed prisoner. The Americans expected bypassed garrisons to quickly collapse, but many survived far longer than anticipated by cultivating gardens and working with local populations. This survival, which might have been seen as admirable resilience, instead prolonged their suffering and irrelevance. General Imamura, reflecting after the war, observed, "We trapped ourselves with our own code. Surrender was impossible, retreat was forbidden, so we remained. The Americans didn't need to defeat us. We defeated ourselves by our inability to adapt to their strategy." For the bypassed garrisons, the war's end brought not relief, but confusion. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka formally surrendered on September 6, 1945, aboard HMS Glory, but they were surrendering forces that hadn't been militarily relevant for over a year. Many smaller garrisons experienced even stranger endings. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to believe the war had ended and continued fighting, against no one, until 1951. They maintained military discipline, conducted patrols, and prepared for an American invasion that had been cancelled 6 years earlier. These holdouts represented the logical extreme of the bypass strategy's psychological impact. So thoroughly had their military purpose been negated that they couldn't conceive of a world where they simply didn't matter anymore. Beyond the strategic implications, the island-hopping strategy inflicted a uniquely cruel form of suffering on Japanese forces. Combat, however terrible, at least offered meaning: death in service of the emperor, sacrifice for the nation. The bypassed garrisons were denied even this cold comfort. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at Walei, wrote, "We do not fear death, we fear meaninglessness. Every day we wake up, conduct military drills for battles that will never come, maintain weapons that will never fire, and pretend we are soldiers when we are actually prisoners of our own making. The medical records from bypassed garrisons reveal the human toll malnutrition affected 80% of troops. Disease rates exceeded 60%. Psychological disorders were endemic. Suicide rates increased dramatically compared to combat units. The island-hopping strategy fundamentally changed warfare in ways that extended far beyond World War II. It demonstrated that controlling key geographic points didn't necessarily mean controlling a region. Traditional military thinking was overturned. The Americans proved you could control the Pacific while ignoring its strong points. The strategy showed that superior supply lines and industrial capacity could negate any tactical advantage. Time became a weapon. By accelerating their own operations while slowing the enemy's, Americans turned the passage of time itself into a strategic advantage. Most importantly, it proved that psychological impact could exceed physical damage. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, former General Hitoshi Imamura published his memoirs. After his conviction for war crimes, he had built a replica of his prison cell in his garden and lived there until his death in 1968, donating all proceeds from his writings to families of Allied prisoners who had died under his command. His assessment of the island-hopping strategy was both professional and personal. We studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu. We prepared for every form of warfare we could imagine. But the Americans created a new form we never imagined: warfare by avoidance, victory through irrelevance. They turned our greatest strength, our willingness to die for our positions, into our greatest weakness. At Rabaul, I commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers. We had ammunition for years of combat, fortifications that could withstand any assault, the will to fight to the last man. None of it mattered. The Americans sailed past us toward Japan, and we could only watch. We were an army of ghosts, haunting positions that no longer mattered, defending territory that had no value, waiting for battles that would never come. This was their genius. They made us defeat ourselves. Every day we held our positions. We weakened Japan. Every soldier growing vegetables at Rabaul was one not defending the homeland. We were not defeated. We were erased. Future military leaders should study the American island-hopping strategy not for its tactical brilliance, but for its strategic revolution. It proved that the best way to defeat an enemy position is not to attack it, but to make it irrelevant. The best way to win a war is to redefine victory itself. We terrified ourselves with our own impotence. We had trained our entire lives for glorious death in combat. The Americans sentenced us to meaningless life in isolation. There is no warrior code that prepares you for irrelevance. We were warriors from an ancient tradition, fighting an enemy from the future. They did not defeat our strategy. They made strategy itself obsolete. This was the true terror of the island-hopping campaign. It showed us that everything we believed about warfare was wrong. The most poignant testament to the island-hopping strategy's psychological impact came from Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who continued fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, 29 years after the war ended. Deployed to Lubang on December 26, 1944, with orders never to surrender, Onoda held out with 3 other soldiers until he was the last survivor. On March 9, 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, flew to Lubang and formally relieved him of duty. Onoda surrendered on March 10, 1974, with his rifle still functioning, 500 rounds of ammunition, and his 30-year-old uniform intact. When asked why he had continued so long, Onoda replied, "I was waiting for the war to come back to me. I never imagined it would leave me behind forever." The Japanese were terrified by America's island-hopping strategy because it represented something worse than defeat. It represented meaninglessness. Every military tradition, every cultural value, every strategic assumption was turned against them. They had prepared for a war of warriors and faced instead a war of engineers and logisticians who treated their island fortresses like obstacles to be driven around rather than enemies to be fought. Approximately 300,000 Japanese troops on bypassed islands didn't just lose the war, they were written out of it. While they maintained their positions, grew their gardens, and slowly starved, the war moved on without them. They were not conquered, they were discarded. They were not defeated, they were ignored. In his final entry before Japan's surrender, Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul wrote, "The Americans have taught us the cruelest lesson of war, that there is something worse than death in battle, irrelevance in victory. We were the Emperor's finest warriors, reduced to growing sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed past us toward the homeland. We were prepared to die gloriously. Instead, we lived meaninglessly. This was their ultimate weapon, not bombs or bullets, but obsolescence itself." The island-hopping strategy succeeded because it attacked not Japanese positions but Japanese purpose, not bodies but beliefs, not fortifications but fundamental assumptions about the nature of war itself. It turned the Pacific Ocean from a field of battle into a highway to victory, and transformed Japanese strongholds from fortresses into prisons of their own making. The terror it inspired came not from what it did, but from what it didn't do. It didn't provide the battle Japanese warriors craved. It didn't validate their sacrifice. It didn't even acknowledge their existence. It simply passed them by, leaving them to discover that the worst fate for a warrior isn't death, it's irrelevance. The warriors of the Empire of the Rising Sun discovered that the setting sun casts the longest shadows, and in those shadows forgotten armies slowly faded into nothing, defeated not by their enemies but by their absence. They had seen the future of warfare, and in it they had no place.